Hello, everyone. My name is Jason McGarva, and I am here interviewing Robert Dilts and Doug O'Brien. And we are here to talk about some of the principles of sleight of mouth. This is from Robert's new book, Sleight of Mouth, Volume 2. This interview is mainly being done for both Robert's students as well as Doug's students. They each have their own body of work, and Doug has a unique way of teaching sleight of mouth. That's where I first learned it. So let's go into quick introductions for each student body. Robert, can you say a little bit more about, we know who you are, of course, you're the author, you're the creator of this, but
Yeah.
can you give a quick introduction for Doug's students who haven't had a chance to learn from you? And then I'll go to Doug, who can introduce himself.
Oh, well, I'll just, I've been involved in the area of neurolinguistic programming since before it had its name, so kind of from its birth, and um, have been, a developer, an author, a trainer, but also a consultant and a coach, applying practitioner, let's say, of NLP for almost 50 years now. And yeah, and of course, modeling is we would say it's sort of the engine, the generative engine, the lifeblood of NLP. And so I've, as an author, I've written over 30 books, generally as a result of modeling different kinds of neuro-linguistic patterns. And sleight of mouth is an example of that, by modeling people that seem to be able to use language very powerfully in a way that could change people's lives, but also even have an impact on the world. So that's why that's the subtitle of this volume too is, how words can change worlds.
Nice, thank you. And Doug O'Brien, you've been my teacher of sleight of mouth. Doug has a unique way of teaching sleight of mouth over an extended period of time. Can you share more about your work?
Sure. Robert Dodge, I think, is being very modest when he says that he's written some books. He wrote NLP Volume 1. He wrote the first book on NLP with some co-authors as well, but really he did the work. And so this latest book, which I happen to have right here, NLP Sleight of Mouth Volume 2, is just more of what he's so great at, which is creating content, creating information, creating ways of thinking about thinking. That's just enlightening. Sleight of mouth, for me, I learned it from Robert back in 1987, I believe it was, when I went to Santa Cruz to do my master practitioner training with him and his partner at the time, Todd Epstein. I met Robert for the first time when I went to a Tony Robbins NLP certification course in the year before that, and he was one of the not participant. He was one of the co-trainers. He did a day or two at Tony's certification course, and I was just so impressed. I thought, geez, I thought Tony was NLP at the time. I thought he was the guy, but when I met Robert, I said, "Oh, there's another guy." So I went and did my master practitioner with Robert, and so glad that I did. And I started teaching sleight of mouth immediately upon my return from that certification course, because a lot of the NLP trainers that I was working with at the time said, "What is that sleight of mouth stuff?" So I did a training like right away on basically what I learned. And as you can see in the background, I'm a piano player. One of the things I've always done is tried to make it so that when I teach something, it's not just teaching the principles of something, but getting it so that my students can do it. As a piano teacher, it's not just so much to sit down and say, "Hey, let me show you how this is supposed to go," and then, "Okay, now you do it." I've installed it into your unconscious mind by playing it that way. It's not that. It's about getting them to, step by step by step, learn the pieces to really put it into all their systems, get it integrated into their body, into their mind. So that's the way I teach. And again, like Robert was saying, we model, we look at people who are great, and Robert has been an inspiration for me over the years. I've attempted in many ways to model him. So, and as much as he's modeled others like Richard Bandler, et cetera, to produce sleight of mouth, I've done a lot of modeling of Robert's way of being, and so yeah.
And I know that any skill that is nuanced, like sleight of mouth, must have principles that govern it. And so, how did you discover these operating principles over time?
Well, I think first of all, I think like anything, as you apply something, you begin to see when it works and when it doesn't, right? What are the differences that make a difference? So some of it comes just through, this notion of getting feedback from applying it. I think others are sort of fundamental NLP principles, that you want to do pacing before leading, we would say. You don't want to just try to dive in and make somebody change their mind. There's principles that involve getting some kind of rapport. There's principles that are also involve being able to, as you were saying, Jason, listen to some of the nuances in the language. So I think, again, probably the simplest answer is it comes from using it and seeing, well, what seems to make it work when it works the best. And also by, the whole modeling process of sleight of mouth is you look at, who are people that have used it well. You could talk about the Martin Luther King Jr.'s, the Nelson Mandelas, whatever the Jesus is, and then you can look at the Hitlers, who also use sleight of mouth, but in a very different way. And you go, okay, there's some underlying difference here. This has a lot of this kind of, this sort of whatever you want to call them, patterns, ways of applying it. This is another whole approach. So I think that would be my first answer there.
Let me ask you a
Huge
question
collaborative.
that's a little bit out of order here, but it dovetails nicely into your musician background, and I'd be curious to hear Robert's point of view on this. So when a person is learning an instrument like a piano or a guitar, they typically learn how to play scales,
Mm,
and there's a lot of benefits to playing scales. Similarly, when you're learning a sport, like I played volleyball, for example, and
mm,
there are certain specific skills, like learning how to improve your vertical leap, and that's a capacity more, right? But you have to learn how to run up to the net and how to position your hand, and working on those individual skills makes your whole game better. So scales and skills.
mm.
I'm curious, what are the equivalent of that? What is the equivalent of scales when it
Yeah.
comes to learning sleight of mouth, and that it'll improve the whole thing?
Yeah, so I'm sure that Doug has a lot to say about this too. Just for me to start, when we talk about skills, so actually in the book, there is a chapter on principles. There is also a chapter on skills, and skills which are different than the patterns themselves. So the skills are what is it that you need to know how to do in order to be able to use that effectively. And these are skills that relate to, for example, skills of generally of skills of persuasion that are not them in and of themselves linguistic necessarily. So, for example, a kind of a skill is getting rapport with somebody. That would be a skill that I would really suggest that anything you're going to do with sleight of mouth, that's going to make it better. There's other skills that involve recognizing the state that a person is in. In the book, I talk about the difference between what I call coach state and crash state. One is a more open receptive state, the other is a more closed, reactive state. Anything you say to somebody when they're in this kind of a crash state is probably not going to go in very well or very easily. So first of all, being able to observe carefully, and detect these differences is another kind of a skill. So I also think, being able to, just learning to listen, that's another skill. So, and also developing a certain level of, let's say, emotional intelligence in NLP. There's a thing that's known as second position, meaning I'm kind of putting myself in somebody else's shoes in their perspective. All of these are the types of skills that you can practice, and that with practice, it's going to make you better at many things, but certainly better at sleight of mouth. And Doug, I'm sure you also have a lot to add to that as well.
I have a lot to add to that. You've left so much out, Robert. It's ridiculous. But I would say that these are not just skills, these are essentials. I mean, I don't think you can really do sleight of mouth without rapport. I
Yeah.
mean, a lot of people argue, a lot of people like duke things out and say this and this and that, but it's not getting anywhere unless you have rapport. And I think that mostly comes from listening. I think that the art of persuasion is to, first of all, to really listen, to fully appreciate where this person is coming from, what their beliefs actually are. And Robert's first book, as I mentioned before, Sleight of Mouth, NLP Volume 1, is called, the subtitle is the structure of the study of the structure of subjective experience.
Yeah.
Subjective experience has a structure to it. Beliefs have a structure to them. The cause, effect, means, three-part normalized belief structure that I guess Robert probably invented, or discerned or named at least, is true. We are surrounded by beliefs all the time. So sleight of mouth is being able to say, what is this person really saying? Listening for what is the actual belief that's being acted upon, if not in fact stated. But we are always acting upon our beliefs all the time. And to really be able to pick those out of the air and say, oh, well, let's work on this one, or let's grab on that one or something. And that's, oh, this one's really important. To really be able to pull those out is an essential skill.
Yeah, I know that I learned from Doug using this thing called the agreement frame.
Yes.
I developed that skill of saying, I can see what you're saying. I mean, after all, and then I would give some supporting evidence before I even dive into any attempt at using any patterns or meta model questions. Let's dive into a few of the principles for people who haven't read the book, or even for people who have, who want to learn this more deeply. There's a few that I was really interested in. First was the outcome frame versus the problem frame. So can you unpack that distinction a little bit and give an example to help us understand this, Robert?
Sure. So I think this is an extremely fundamental distinction, because one of the things we would say is that, when you use language, right? Language, that's one of the principles of sleight of mouth, is that energy follows attention and language directs attention, right? So the words that I'm using right now are, as Doug was pointing out, it's directing our attention, which is that's going to determine a lot about what our subjective experience is. So we would say that, language is kind of operating as a sort of filter on experiences. I can take the same experience and I can pull out all the things that were potential problems. This went wrong. The basic idea of the problem frame is, what's wrong? Whose fault is it? Why did that go wrong? And basically, who's to blame? The outcome frame is the opposite. It's okay, not what's wrong, but what do you want instead? What do we want? Where do we want to go? How are we going to get there? What resources are available to get us there? And I think when you use language, in that way, it's solution oriented. Otherwise, what's just happening is you could say you're sort of either going down a rabbit hole, or you're going to be able to sort of create a more virtuous circle. So now, what would be an example? All you have to do is look at, modern politics, and you'll see lots of problem frames. What's wrong with this, this country? What's wrong with this party? What's wrong? Da, da, da. This is wrong. That's wrong. This is bad. That's going wrong. Versus, all right, what is our vision for what we want? Where are we trying to go? How are we going to improve that? So those would be kind of, but sort of a basic, orientation on that. And Doug, I'm sure you also have some good examples. And
well, what I would say about what you just said about politics is interesting, though. Part of what sleight of mouth is based on, I think, Robert, correct me if I'm wrong, is the Polya patterns of plausible inference.
Right.
That there are 5 Polya patterns, and one of the Polya patterns is to disprove the converse.
Right.
So that happens in politics all the time. If there are 2 candidates, and we can say, well, this guy's really bad. Oh my God, he's horrible. Look how bad. Look at all the terrible things he's done. Well, then who else are you going to vote for except the other guy?
Right.
If there's only 2, then and you've disproved the converse, then, well, this must be true. Then this must be right, or must be good, or whatever. So that's one of the reasons the problem frame is so beloved by politicians and people who want to blame the other guy, right? So that's why it's really hard to get rid of. So, we almost always have to be in a situation like a coaching situation, where we get to use the outcome frame, where we get to use the solution oriented frame, because it's not that actively engaged in normal life by most people. It's a lot easier just to blame the other person and to cast aspersions.
I'm curious about something with this. I've heard that there's something called we have a negativity bias.
Yeah.
You know, in our brain, we're hardwired to be more oriented toward negativity as a survival
Hmm.
thing. Can you speak to how this might apply to the problem frame and our tendency to go to the problem frame and how we can get good at recognizing and shifting people out of it?
Yeah, I mean, this idea of negativity bias is that obviously, and I think, by the way, this also relates to what I was talking about in this notion of your inner state, meaning a coach state or crash state. Why do we have a negativity bias? Is because it's out of the desire for safety. So if I want to be safe, I've got to look for where the danger is and avoid the danger. So safety makes perfect sense. I've got to find out where all the likely negative things are, the problems are. The big paradox, of course, of the problem frame comes from this notion that because energy follows attention, and I and this is what we call the paradox of negation. If I go, oh, well, we don't want to have this happen. We don't want to be thinking this way. It's like telling the kid who's, walking with a glass of water, don't spill that water, don't spill it away, don't shake like that. What's going to happen? That's where all the energy is going. So there's a really fascinating paradox with this negativity bias, which is the whole idea is I'm supposed to be avoiding it. And yet by bringing attention to it, I'm much more likely to actually produce that as the result. So again, and then I think what you want to do is this idea of, we would call it a kind of verbal Aikido. And this is this notion of pacing and leading. I want to acknowledge the intention. And usually what's interesting is, the negativity bias is I want to avoid something, right? I want to avoid being hurt. And so what you want to do to Aikido that is you say, okay, so if you can avoid being hurt, what will you do, right? Sometimes we call this the meta outcome question, the outcome of the outcome, right? My outcome is to stop this person from, doing harm. So if you could stop that person from doing harm, what would that accomplish? Then what would you be able to do? So that's this kind of interesting way of doing a kind of a verbal Aikido. And
Nice. And
yeah.
yeah, go ahead,
Yes.
Doug.
So yes, in the verbal Aikido, going back to the agreement frame that you mentioned earlier, Jason, the way that I've taught it to you and to others is the way I learned it from Tony Robbins, which is that I agree or I appreciate or I respect and that you use the word and instead of the word
But
but, which helps you just do that verbal Aikido. So where you agree and you accept the energy and then you say and, then you reframe it and put it in another direction. It is also a pattern interrupt because
mhm,
most
mhm.
people are not going to be ready for that. Most people are going to be ready for yes, but, right? They're going to be ready for yeah, no, no, yeah, well, yeah, sort of, but and they're ready for that. So they're not ready for you to go like, oh yeah, that's right. I agree with you. That is so true. And Jason, you have created your whole new way of doing it too. You go like, I see what you mean there, and you really have
Well,
another.
yeah, what I do is I say after all. So, I can actually see what you're saying, after all, and then I give a supporting example
Supporting,
to
yeah,
make sure they
exactly.
understand that I get them.
Yeah,
So you're
yeah.
further guiding them down that pathway
Mhm.
before you turn them around. But and that principle of using the and instead of the but is, I think, essential to
Yeah.
really doing persuasion. Because to persuade isn't just to win an argument, is to help them actually see that there's a different way of looking at this thing. The idea of having, an object in the center of a circle and looking at it from one perspective and then looking at it from a whole different side of the circle is to say that, who's perceiving this thing is correct from their perspective. I would see it exactly the same way if I was standing over here. And if you look at it from over on this side of the circle, you'll probably notice that it looks like the way I was describing it from over here. It's not one person's right and one person's wrong. We're both right from these different perspectives. We just need to be able to, guide them to seeing it from this other side. If
Got
that
it.
makes
And I see, I can feel something else coming up too, which this is around the problem frame, which is when you do effectively change someone's mind, but perhaps they belong to a community that all believes something similar, there might be this, I can see your point, but everybody I know thinks this way. Not now what? And they go right back to having this is a problem. This new point of view
Sure.
is a problem, and now there's cognitive dissonance. Like, and where do you go from there?
Yeah, that's huge. And there's a book called gosh, How to Have Impossible Conversations, I
Yeah, I've
believe.
read it.
Mm-hmm.
That talks a lot about that thing, that people will often adopt beliefs not because they actually thought about them and believe them, but because that's what people in their tribe are believing. So in order to be a part of that tribe, I'll believe that same thing.
Yeah.
So it's the belonging of the tribal community rather than the belief itself that's important to them. So they'll believe whatever the tribe believes.
Yeah. This I think gets to the root of what I talk about in the book, and both volumes 1 and 2 of Sleight of Mouth, of what's known as a thought virus.
Mm,
So the metaphor of a thought virus is it's a belief that is not my own belief, right? So some of our beliefs, either positive or limiting, are beliefs that we create through our own life experiences, right? I've experienced something and I make a generalization about that. But other beliefs, and many of them, as you're pointing out, Doug, they don't come from me. They're not something that I decided myself based on my own life experience.
right.
And when it is that way, by the way, it's actually much easier to correct because I start getting some different examples. I go, oh wow, I made this generalization. Now I see that that's not the case. I see that there are these other points of view, just like you
Hmm.
were saying. Like,
Right.
oh, when I look at this sphere from the other side, I see a different image. But the thought virus, and this is where one of the interesting things is kind of where um, sleight of mouth even started, is that you're preserving this particular belief that you're using sleight of mouth to basically find any way to not disprove you were talking about, or I'm finding all these
Right.
other ways to, let's say, disprove the converse. So it's not even about um, the actual validity of the generalization. And again, if you take the metaphor of a virus, it's harmful to a person. You pick it up from somebody else.
Hmm.
It's not that you're bad or they're bad, but you've been kind of, this kind of uh, how do we say, this sort of filter has been put in place, and then it becomes, and I think this whole notion that you were just bringing up, Doug, about why do I keep this belief even if it's harmful to me or others, is based on, and I think another key aspect that I think is also a skill and of sleight of mouth is that there is some positive intention that doesn't not actually relate to the content of that belief. So like
Mm,
you were saying, Doug, I want to have the sense of belonging to my tribe.
right.
So that doesn't really have anything to do with the content of the belief. It could be anything, but if having that belief is what lets me know I belong to that, and I'm a team player, so I'm gonna take this on, whether it's right or wrong, it's all for one for all kind of
That's
thing.
right. And it's interesting because it is, again, a belief level. So it's another level of belief that if I believe this belief, then I'll be part of this tribe. And that means I'm
Yeah.
accepted by my tribe. So there's beliefs all over the place.
Yeah. That's what we would call in the sleight of mouth. That what you were just describing, Doug, is also like a metaframe, right? It's a
Right.
belief about a belief.
Belief
And
about it.
Jason, to coming back to your question, that's probably the way that I would approach it, right? Is, if you are in the system where everybody shares this belief, and the whole idea of sleight of mouth is, now I never want to then go against the content of that belief. And I think that's the whole notion of when you see the sleight of mouth patterns, there are all these operators around the belief. None of them are really designed to say this belief is wrong, because if you do that, you're basically asking, for all the resistance to come back. So, you have things like a metaphor, a metaframe. So again, and this is how you can do this, what you were calling this agreement frame, and then open up some other possibility for a different perspective. So we say, become more not, open to doubt, rather than I'm going to, then taking this binary approach that it's right or it's wrong. You sort of are starting to you might call it deconstruct that belief. Like Doug, you were talking about those three
Hmm.
parts of belief. I want to
Yeah.
start constructing that. I want to start developing a kind of what we call, a meta perspective. Most of the time, I mean, when I first started working with sleight of mouth and beliefs, I might say to somebody, gosh, that seems like a pretty limiting belief. And they would go, that's not a belief. That is how it is. It is this way. So first is realizing, oh, this is a belief is already a particularly profound thing to do, that this is
Yeah.
a system.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So the model of the world frame, if you
Yeah,
will, to say, well,
exactly.
that's, that could be true in your model of the world and
Yeah,
my model of the world. But yeah, absolutely. To call it a belief and have them see it as a belief can sometimes be a huge first step in shifting it because they've just thought it was just simply reality,
yeah,
just like this is a book. It's like, well, of course it's a book. What?
yeah.
There's no discussion about that. It's a thing. It's a belief. It's reality. So to say no, it's actually a belief is, sometimes great. Now, I will also say, Robert, interestingly about this way of um, kind of holding on to negative beliefs, in a way, you can speak to this more than I can, but in a way, the original way that I learned sleight of mouth from you originally was that you said that you modeled Richard Bandler in all of his trainings, that he would have people, he would adopt a crazy belief and
Yeah,
argue for their holding on to this crazy belief and get everybody else to try to get him past this crazy belief. But he would always stick with this crazy
right,
belief because he
right.
was so facile at the sleight of mouth patterns.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that's an example, I think, of a way of using sleight of mouth in not such a great way.
Well, what the way that Richard was, to be honest, the way that Richard did this, and it was the time I think I wrote about this, and I think there's even a transcription of it in the Sleight of Mouth Volume 1. There was actually a guy that he was doing this demonstration with, and he was trying to get this guy was having all these negative things about his girlfriend. And anytime Richard would try to, sort of pose another perspective, the guy would go, no, because that's not true, because, and then he'd do some kind of what we would call today sleight of mouth. And what Richard decided to do was, I think he did this on purpose to sort of make a point that, is almost like to create this meta frame so that people realized this is all about having this belief and being unwilling to
Hmm.
let go of it. So he was actually sort of doing it as a kind of a demonstration. Then of course, I think it got to be, it's kind of fun after a
Like a
while.
party trick.
Yeah, it's a game. It becomes like a game that people, it's like debate class or something.
Right, right.
And then you're gonna be persistent and you're gonna win. But
Right.
yeah, I think that this is why I say is probably one of the most important reasons to know about sleight of mouth is because it's the way that these kinds of cognitive biases are held in place. And again, this whole idea of getting some level of awareness that that is what is happening
Yeah.
is the first step to being free of it.
Let me share a perspective that one of my spiritual teachers said. He said a lot of people when they look at something, it's like looking at one star in the sky, and that one star is the meaning that they hold around a
Right.
certain thing, like a wound. And what he likes to do, and what I do in my own work too, is to help people see a constellation of meanings,
Exactly.
Mm.
so that
Mm.
it's a like an abandonment is a horrible thing, right? If someone has an abandonment wound and they can spend their whole life trying to get their needs met in the area of abandonment, but abandonment can also give you a sense of purpose, helping other people who have been abandoned, and it can give you this deep drive, So there's, yes, it's a wound. Yes, it's bad to do to people, and it can give you this very deep ability to love humanity as
Yeah.
well. So there's what's true depends on where you're standing and what you're looking at. And hopefully, sleight of mouth can help people widen their viewpoint to see a more of a constellation than just a star.
Absolutely. Like I was saying, to me, the whole point of sleight of mouth I think your example is great because it's not like going, that star is wrong. You're saying,
Mhm.
hey, so there's patterns. They go, look at this star, yes, and there's these stars. Oh, and have we noticed this? Oh, and there's also this. It's really like you were saying, Doug, it's the and frame.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
here's this belief, and if we chunk it down, here's something else. And if you go to this consequence, or if you go to this counterexample, that's interesting. And so it's more. adding to, I mean, NLP has said from the beginning, you never want to take away a choice, right? You're always going to try to add choices.
Mm.
So when you add choices, it's like this metaphor of bringing more stars into the sky. And I think it's interesting. I also like this metaphor because you think about when you look up and you don't see the other stars, why not? Either there's too much ambient light. I mean, it's kind of there's a lot of interesting, sort of analogies there about, well, what does it mean to use sleight of mouth effectively and try to help somebody? Actually, it's rather interesting. One of the examples I'm using in the second volume is, this whole notion of flat earthers. Now, flat earthers would go, there is no stars up there. This is a project. No, there's not a moon up there. It's a projection on, on a dome around this flat world. That gets really interesting where you're going,
Huh.
wow, because you can take, I mean, there's people believe that and they have whole conventions around this.
Really?
Yeah.
I've always
So
wondered why someone like Elon Musk doesn't just take a few of those influencers up into a rocket and say, there, now we're, let's see how you handle
Explain this one.
explain this one.
oh,
Um,
Elon, that was good virtual reality that you were showing there,
Yeah, they probably
yeah,
could.
yeah. Let me shift over to a different, just given our time. I want
Yeah,
to
yeah,
talk about the logical levels of change, because that's
yeah.
something that's very interesting to me. As someone who has done personal growth since I was about 15 and I'm 48 now, a
Mm,
lot of it doesn't stick.
yeah.
And that is, I think, because of a lack of integration, a lack
Mm,
of taking months of time, really wiring it into your environment, to your, even looking at your capacities, your values, your beliefs. And
right,
I'm really interested in how to use sleight of mouth with the logical levels in mind, because you're making surgical snips at different levels to try and create some more movement, flexibility, and freedom.
right.
So, can you speak to uh, how sleight of mouth can help someone when their belief structure is tied to all these different logical levels,
Mm.
environment, identity, and so on?
Well, I mean, what I would first say is that in terms of this pyramid of levels, so belief is a level, right? And it's actually a very pivotal level because if you take this pyramid, you have these bottom three levels are your environment, so your external world, your behavior, so how I concretely, interact with that, and then your sort of internal maps, the competencies and capabilities I developed, the ability to use language at all, the ability to, navigate. That we say that, so that's how, what, when, and where, right? Now, beliefs are why, right? So why that how? Why that when? Why that where? I mean, that was the original idea. But beliefs also become tied to these levels above, which are identity, and you could call it purpose. So identity is, when I say I believe, well, the I who believes is not presumably not the belief, right? The I who is believing it is something that is, the belief is a kind of a neuro-linguistic program. Then there is something beyond the I, right? This is the whole notion of what it's talking about spiritual teaching. I'm part of something bigger than myself. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is then, neuro-linguistically, so these different levels, we in fact tend to call them neurological levels because they're not just logic, they are something that literally engages more or less of the nervous system. And I think this is the key that you were bringing up, Jason. So some modes of change, right? I can understand why I should do something differently, but it doesn't mean I believe that, believe it. I can know that I should do something, but it doesn't mean I am going to do it because knowing it is very different than actually believing it or integrating it into my identity, or as you were also saying, Jason, getting it in the muscle. You were talking, Doug, you were talking about practicing the piano. Right? I got to get it in the muscle. I can know the scale, doesn't mean I can play the scale.
Mhm. Mhm.
So this is this idea of different levels, and that requires then, and I think this is what the whole notion of practice is about, is I need to get it in all of these different nervous structures. So again, if when I believe something, it's not just in my head. It actually, you would say it engages things like the limbic system, the amygdala, where suddenly my heart is involved, not just my verbal mind. So the big challenge of a lot of sleight of mouth is you're leading off verbally. You're sort of leading to the verbal mind, but what you're trying to do is get beyond the verbal mind. You're trying to get to something that is deeper than that. And that means, okay, I've got to get this into these other levels. Now, that's where some of these skills we were talking about come in. And that's also where nonverbal communication and also engaging what we would call one of these principles. I need to engage other multiple, and we call multiple intelligences. I can use language to paint a visual image instead of just arguing about which word to use. I can, use language to engage emotion. So I think these are all part of that is um, there's always going to be this pyramid. And what I'm always going to be wanting to do is realize that I'm engaging this pyramid at one level, at a belief level. I'm trying to then, get it to go beyond that. But that's going to probably be something that is going to, that's why, again, why some of these other skills are so important. And the skills and the scales, as you were saying. Doug, I'm sure you also have.
I do. I think that you are completely wrong about everything you
Of
said.
course.
But interestingly, the logical levels thing, again, Robert invented that. So it's hard to say that he's wrong about anything because he made it up. But the way I've been using it a lot of times is to think that they are actually, we have beliefs about identity. We have beliefs about beliefs. We have beliefs about capabilities, beliefs about our behaviors, which is why I think hypnosis works so well, right? Because we learn from our experience. One of the greatest thing you can do is, if you're an Ericksonian hypnotherapist, is to say, hey, go climb Squawk Peak, have somebody go do something. Because when they've done it, when they've actually embodied it, done it in their bodies, they learn it on a whole different level.
Right.
And, I know for a fact that, if you go into a different environment, then you're going to have very different access to your abilities than you would in a different environment. Like, so for instance, if I walk into a convention of flat earthers, I might find myself suddenly not able to be rapport building with folks or something. I might lose some of my abilities in certain situations. So then I might draw a belief from that says, well, I'm not a very good conversationalist or something, because of that experience in that environment. I might say, well, this is what happened. And so now I believe that because I couldn't have a conversation in that environment, then I'm really kind of not a good learner, right? So I can draw beliefs about my identity from an experience that I had in an environment, so they're all kind of connected. And I think hypnosis works because it gives you a vicarious experience. If we did a hypnotic trance and you believed and you really saw yourself at that convention and really experienced that same sort of thing, even though it was hypnotic, you'd still kind of get that same deep learning from it.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Yeah, you go ahead.
I can imagine. I'd be very curious to know what the identity level thinking is with a flat earther. Do they believe that they're an insider, that they know the real truth, that their purpose is to free people? And
Yeah.
is that overriding purpose?
Yeah, usually it's an interesting thing. And thank you for bringing that up, because one of the things I was pointing out when I was talking about these kind of, you know, thought viruses, and especially if you take conspiracy theories, so it starts off that, well, we know the Earth is flat because you can't see it round, well, but you send up, but you see there's pictures of the Earth. Yeah, but even NASA admits that those are composites, that they're not, it's not a real actual picture. Da, da, da. And besides, they can be faked. And then, of course, they have to do that to keep their job. And you eventually always get back to that there is some negatively intended anonymous other who is trying to control you or do something to harm you. So that always gets back to that kind of thing. So this is where you get into, it's coming out of fear-based, something is threatening my safety or my agency. And so I've got to attack it. And I think that's almost all of these things are going to come, you find they all get traced back to that. The flat earthers will even get to this point where they said, that's why they had to kill Kennedy, because he wanted to try to go to the moon and he would have exposed the whole thing, all this stuff. And you go, wait a minute, Copernicus was it? Well, that's all fake, how do
Mm.
you know? This is all the stuff that the government is feeding you. This is all stories. So you go, wow, it's so interesting. From this intention, you can generate worlds. That's why I say, words create worlds. And it's rather amazing. And again, though, Doug, you were making a super important point because you create those worlds because they become increasingly disassociated from anything of your own actual experience, right?
Mm.
Anything that you experienced in your body. And this is one of the reasons that I was saying I published the Sleight of Mouth 2 now, 25 years after Sleight of Mouth 1, is that we are living in an increasingly Sleight of Mouth world, a world where you've got you've got the metaverse, you've got virtual reality, you've got social media, where you're inundated with things that you have no direct experience of, and so you're getting these let's say, ungrounded, disconnected realities where the words are the reality and it never comes back to some kind of ground. And I think this is what is, so this is why it's so important to be able to recognize that and to come back to these things we were talking about. Get it grounded in your experience, in the muscle, as it were.
Yeah.
Just to come back to the logical levels thing real quick. Like I'm personally very interested in creating some kind of a drill to help practice
Mm,
sleight of mouth while
mm,
targeting the different levels. Like, so if someone has a belief like I'm just bad at learning, as evidenced by how bad I did in school, uh, that's more of an identity, an
mm,
I am statement. But let's say that they were raised in a dysfunctional family where there was drinking going on at night and the person never got any sleep and so on. And so maybe it's the environment that you were raised in that made it difficult to succeed in school. I mean, I remember hearing somebody say once, it doesn't matter how many times you wash your car. If you live in a swamp, it's never going to stay clean. And that's what I mean about trying to target the different levels when you're using these
Mhm.
patterns to try and create some of the snips that are holding a belief together.
So one of the things I was saying before that I was jokingly saying Robert was wrong about everything is that I believe beliefs happen at all those levels. So that
mm,
if you are in an environment, then you will generate a belief about that environment that says, well, if I'm a bad learner in this environment, then that means that I am a product of the environment. And if I move to a different environment, then, so if I move to a different environment, then I can learn better. And that means I'm a good learner. So what does that mean that I'm capable of? It means I'm capable of learning. If I move to a different environment, then, so you create if then means at all these different levels. If I'm capable if I'm capable, then I believe that I can move to other, we generate beliefs all the time in every area and situation. So that, yes, I think a person who's coming out of an environment like that can probably get to a place where they say, well, if I succeeded in spite of all those hardships, that means I'm really a great learner deep down inside. And that means I'm capable of learning in any environment. And that will bring me to a place where I can share that with other people and go to a purpose in life that takes me to a whole
Mm.
other area entirely.
yeah.
That would be
Yeah.
a powerful case study if we had someone like that.
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, I agree with everything Doug said, especially that I'm wrong. But no, yeah, this idea that you have beliefs at every level, of course. And actually, it's very interesting. And I think this is where one of the things that I was just doing this last week, literally this last weekend, is a program called Sleight of Mouth 3. So there's a kind of a beginning one and advanced one, Sleight of Mouth 3. And Sleight of Mouth 3 is where I'm combining these sleight of mouth patterns, but using them through what are called the patterns of genius. So I'm going, okay, we were talking this before, that, what's the difference between how Hitler is using these and how Gandhi is using these? Well, one is, okay, you're going away from something, you're making negative identity judgments, da 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 da. If you look at patterns of genius, so patterns of genius were people that I modeled from, the Einsteins, the Leonardo da Vinci's, the Mozarts, etc. People who did something, who generated something positively to create a better world in some way. And so one of the things we're doing is saying, okay, if I'm going to use sleight of mouth, before I start saying anything, I want to get into use these patterns of genius, create this future. So what is the future? This is the outcome frame. What is the future I want to create? What is the world to which I want to belong? Now, from there, then you will have a different perspective. So, and I bring this up because I just wanted to give this example. So, working with a woman whose her starting limiting belief was, I'm a weakling. And of course, just like you were saying, she had a whole lot of experiences in her life. She could look back and she could prove it this way, this way, this way. Look at all these experiences. And the problem is that this is exactly how what language works, right? It's a filter. So one of the things we talk about the meta structure of belief. Why do I believe that? Because this. Look, it's true. I show you in my life experience, this happened. Now, of course, what I'm leaving out is the trillion other things that also happened, right? The trillion things that are not the 5 things that are just because of that stand out because of this belief. So the belief creates a filter, and especially an identity belief, right? I am a weakling. So what happened there is then we come to the future. She gets to this other state, looks back, and suddenly she realizes, wait a minute, now what I see is that I'm a courageous explorer. I'm looking at exactly the same life, but with a different sort of set of filters. Now, this is again the interesting thing is, and it's again why belief is so important is because the belief will filter your experience of your environment. Your belief will filter your experience of your behavior. 2 people could do the same thing and one person has a different belief about it and it filters the meaning of it. So,
Exactly.
yeah. Go ahead. What, Doug?
I just said exactly. Yeah, that's you keep going. You're on a roll. Yeah, that's beautiful.
Just, but I think the whole point is then what I'm wanting, the way that I've been developing the practice of sleight of mouth is you want to, it's not just about, okay, this person has a belief that I don't like. I'm going to go try to get them to change their belief. It's what is the future I want to create, right? What is the world that would be great? So if somebody has a lot of wounding, what would be the future that they want? Not just how do I get rid of this wound? That, because again, and even this whole idea that we've been talking about, I get rid of the wound, but all of the things that create the wound are still in place. So I think this is where I don't know. Your question, Jason, was: is there a practice where you can, as you're using sleight of mouth, keep in mind this notion of the pyramid? And I think it's first of all just knowing that it's there and knowing that it makes a difference. Knowing as to what Doug said, that there's always going to be these connections between these different levels. I think that's the first practice is just getting that sense that yeah, we're living in this pyramid, and you want to have it's not just taking this slice from this part of the pyramid, but you're always trying to align all of those different levels. So
Well, I can see the value in learning how to both slice and stitch because
yeah.
I imagine you can use sleight of mouth to help wire in a new reality, a new possible attractive future for the person to move into rather than leaving it to them just to hope, figure it out.
Precisely.
You know
Yeah.
what I mean?
I think
Um,
when you're doing sleight of mouth well, you're always doing both. You're slicing and stitching at the same time. You're dissuading them, if you will, from being in this reality over here, and helping to build a stronger appreciation of this reality over here, and saying, let's go here. So I just want to say that one of the real basic things about NLP is still always true with sleight of mouth, which is that you separate the person from the behaviors.
The identity from behavior. Exactly.
Yeah. The identity from the behaviors. So, who they are is held as a constant. They're wonderful people. They're beautiful, wonderful people, and they're doing stupid things, or they're maybe believing things that lead them to do stupid things or whatever. So you're helping them to maintain that, beautiful personness and create identities and capabilities and behaviors and things that are congruent with that instead of the things that are showing them to be otherwise.
By the way, I've been starting to do a lot of programs. I'm doing programs just on logical levels these days. I have like a whole 4-day program where that's all based on the levels. And one of the things we're looking at, for example, is you go, well, what is identity? And one of my favorite ways of talking about identity is, I think it's an old Asian proverb that goes, Each of us is like all of us. Each of us is like none of us. Each of us is like some of us. And so the first part is, yeah, one truth about me is that I'm a human being. I'm a human like everybody else, right? We're all the same. That is part of my identity. Second part is I'm completely unique. I'm just like my fingerprint. There's not a single other person in the world at all like me. That's a second truth. Third
Uh,
truth is I came from this background with this family. I have these beliefs, da da da. So I'm like some of us. And keeping in mind that all of those are actually, this three-dimensional identity, they're all true. And helping this, I think the thing that helps to free us from those identities that are locked into the I'm like some of us. I am my personal history. I am the family I was raised in. I am what I was taught in school. You realize, wait a minute, there's these two other dimensions where, I'm like everybody else and I'm like nobody else. That's what starts to free you. And I think the last thing I would want to say or point out that was really important for me, is what we really stress a lot in the Sleight of Mouth 3 program is when you're using sleight of mouth, rather than make a statement, I always encourage people to say, ask the question first. Rather than go, here's a counterexample. You go, can you think of any, is there any examples? Rather than say to somebody, this is your intention, or this, actually, you can turn the sleight of mouth pattern into a question. What it actually is, it's really it comes from a mindset. It is not just a verbal recipe. It's actually a mindset for approaching something. And if I can, and that mindset is often much more easily transmitted through a question than through a statement, when the
mm,
statement can then be rejected or accepted. The question is opening a possibility, a thinking. So you can't just reject the question. You can't say, well, that question is right or wrong. It's just a question.
mm,
So by being able to do that helps with this Aikido process. And again, it stimulates a thinking in certain mindset rather than, I've got to, reject or accept this. So this, again, I think is maybe an important part of, some of the things that we've been exploring here of how do you use this in a way that especially if somebody has this feeling of, I need to have this belief in order to be appreciated or to be loved or to belong. Well, now the opening this, again, opening what you were saying, the more the galaxy than just the single star, I think can be done through that questioning.
Well, I will say I've been using that approach with group facilitation where I'll take a limiting belief and I'll be like, all right, first of all, what are some reasons that a person might believe this? And I'm surprised by all the reasons I never would have thought of that are coming back. And I'd say, okay, you can feel there's a positive intention under this, right? There's a positive reason why a person would think this way. What are some of those positive intentions? And I get back so much more, and it's so much more
Right.
engaging with the group than me just firing a one-liner at people.
Exactly.
For people watching this, they want to learn from the both of you. Robert, how can somebody get on your email list to learn? I want to know about Sight of Mouth 3. I didn't know about this until just now. I want to know more about
Yeah.
your trainings. Like,
First time last week. Um, so by probably the easiest way to get a hold of me is through my website, which is just, robertdilts.com or nlpu.com. They actually both go to the same place. There's also diltsstrategygroup.com, but again, I think those are the simplest ways. And my schedule is generally there, and the things that are the new things that are happening will be on that website.
nice. And Doug O'Brien, how can people learn more about your sleight of mouth programs and your trainings?
well, there's a website called sleightoфmouth.org, which could be good. Um, but also ericksonian.com is one of my websites, and essentialcoachingskills.com is one of my websites.
By the way, thank you, Doug. That does remind me. There is a devoted website to sleight of mouth that is 7007.info. So think James Bond, 7007.info, and it's got a bunch of the stuff. Actually, that's where like the Sleight of Mouth 3 program would be. That was done in translated into Russian language, by the way, for all Russian speakers, right, including Ukraine and all the other Russian speaking countries. So getting it out there to hopefully bring some change. We say, words create worlds. Which world do we want to create?
Hmm.
And the words that are going to be able to do that. And thank you both. I mean, Doug, first of all, you've been so appreciative. I just want to say how much I appreciate you and how much you have taken this banner of sleight of mouth and run with it. And I'm proud and impressed. So thank you.
Oh, thanks, man. Appreciate that. Well, thanks, Jason. Thanks for setting this up. It's been a privilege and an honor to be on the same stage with Robert here. And yes, I've taken the banner and run with it, but it was his banner. I stole it, so that's why I'm running.
Completely wrong. So
That's why
I took it in the right direction.
Well, and I just think this is important to me because I really think that if people learn how to believe, not just what to believe, and also more importantly, how to dismantle and dissolve beliefs that are proven to create harm.
Yeah.
But what do you do when that belief is right?
Yeah.
You think that it's right. So how do you start to untangle that? Most people can't do that. And this is a great tool chest to do that.
Yeah, it's a great tool test, and I would just want to iterate one more time that it's really about rapport and listening before trying to shift and change anything. Just really, really start from where you are before you go anywhere else.
Yeah, and
All right,
become curious. Ask questions.
Become curious.
I'm curious. Well,
Well said, Jason. Well said.
thank you both for being here, and thank you to whoever's watching this. I hope you got value from this, and there's so much here you're going to need to watch it again. And yeah, thanks again, everybody.